Hello, welcome to Arcserve Unified Data Protection Sizing Scaling Best Practice Review. This is another episode where we will discuss deployment breakdowns and component sizing recommendation. My name is Gary Sussman, Principal Sales Consultant here at Arcserve, and let's begin. Deployment breakdowns of Arcserve Unified Data Protection comes in two flavors. First is a standalone server deployment. This is when all components, both the console, recovery point server, or RPS, and the agent is installed on one server. This single server acts as both the management interface, web portal, and the destination for backups. If you're doing RHA, this also can be also installed. And also, this machine can act as a proxy server if you're doing host-based agentless backups. Keep in mind that this machine should have access to where the VM are located. Another way of deploying Arcserve Unified Data Protection is in a distributive component deployment. Each component is separately installed on separate servers. Multiple RPSs can be managed by a single console. You can have also multiple consoles. It really depends on the environment and its complexity. You can also therefore include other agents, multiple plans, groupings, more complex design. For a standalone deployment, here are the recommended hardware specs. When a UDP console, RPS server, and HA is deployed, typically with deduplication and no SSD, 64-bit machine, 4 cores, with 16 gigs of memory is typical. If you're adding more capabilities like virtual standby or other types of functionality, we recommend a little bit more. In addition to this, to just run the RPS, additional memory is required for the processing of the data. The processing with the hash deduplication requires additional memory. 8 gigs of memory additional to each additional 1 terabyte of unique data you're protecting. To offload this memory, you can utilize solid state disk SSD drives. This is called the deduplication on the hash device or SSD mode. Typically, 1 gig SSD is required per 15 terabyte of protected data, typically. I would recommend using our online tool for more further details. An RPS requires Windows 2000 Server 2008 R2 or later. You may need a numerous of recovery point servers depending on where the backup is performed, the frequency of the data that you need to protect, and of course, your recovery point objective. When deploying agents, this is to protect those machines. We support physical machines and also workstations. We support the following: both 32, 64-bit, 2-core minimum with 4 gigs of memory, Windows 2003 Server R2 and above, and as early as Vista for Windows workstations. In a distributed deployment, this is when you have more resources. You can distribute the load for more capabilities. For a console with our HA, typically, again, 64-bit, 4-core, 8 gigs of memory, Windows 2008 R2 or later. This is what can install the, again, SQL database, typically 25,000 nodes per console is required. RPS, you may need many of these depending on the resource location. This backup resource with deduplication with no SSD, 64-bit, 4 cores, 16 gigs. Added more memory for the deduplication capability without SSD mode, 8 gigs of memory per additional 1 terabyte of unique data. If you'd like to run with SSD mode, then typically 1 100 gigs of SSD per 1 terabyte space is used to save memory on that server. Also, Windows 2000 R2 server or later. For virtual backups, we need a proxy server to offload these tasks. This is how we can accomplish no agent deployment inside the virtual machine. 32-bit, 64-bit, Windows Server 2003 or later, with enough memory, 8 gigs to be exact, to run as the proxy server. Typically, one proxy is recommended per hypervisor, but it already depends on, again, how the proxy is accessing the machine, uh, amount of capacity needed to back up, and for the amount of time uh, as far as RPO. Virtual standby is a machine that will do the conversion into a hypervisor for DR. This is one of our capabilities. Just like Instant VM, we can convert any recovery point into a virtual machine. This proxy acts as that uh, middleman for that conversion. Again, similar to the proxy above, this can be also a Vista machine workstation as well. Agents as well, we can protect, requires similar resources. 4 gigs of memory, though, supports Server 2003, Vista workstations or later. Some examples of configurations I'd like to review next. This approach is just the overall best practices in different environments, cater to small, medium, or large. First, small environments. Typically, these environments lack resources. They may not have the capabilities to do deduplication or not. It depends on the environment. RPSs without deduplication, typically you configure the backup destination on a direct attach, a local disk, or a network attached device, iSCSI preferably, or CIFS using SMB. This configuration can still use duplication to save storage space using SSD, but it's up to the environment. As the environment grows, this is definitely something to consider as resources will need it. Most SSB, again, utilize a single destination when you deploy like this. In these small environments, with deduplication, we recommend either SSD mode or pure mode. Optimal, we recommend the SSD mode. Using pure mode, typically in these small environments, you can figure all the paths on the same volume or disk. But keep in mind, this is not optimized or optimal, I should say, because it's a single point of failure. Using SSD mode does provide some segmentation by using SSD for the hash destination. Again, with the deduplication, we require 4 destinations. Backup destinations where we store the data from. This is where logically the data is represented. The dedupe data destination is where the dedupe data, the unique data is stored. Hash is our dedupe reference where we have our uniqueness, and the index is, of course, indexing all this information. Having SSD with a hash, it definitely increases performance. Again, reduces the data, and the performance improves. Mid-sized environments have a little more resources they can provide. The RPS data store is configured typically with deduplication and with SSD for the hash location. The backup destination typically is direct attach or a NAS, again, depending on the amount of data that needs to be transferred, and of course, your RPO. CIF shares has more benefit than SMB. Just keep that in mind. Also provides more security. The dedupe data, we have the data and the index. These are typically on a direct attached or Something greater than SIF shares, as you see, iSCSI, a fiber channel. We definitely would recommend RAID for these environments to give you a little more fault tolerance. Since this is a mid-sized environments, that's something to keep in mind of. And also, again, SSD for the hash location to save on memory. Next, we'll talk about example for a large environment. Definitely, you should split your resources. Definitely, you should use deduplication, RAM on our hash. I'm sorry, SSD for our hash to lower the RAM. Backup destination, all destinations be on direct attach or SAN storage in this case because it's a large environment. RAID definitely to account for fault tolerance. So this is definitely aimed for larger environments like MSPs, large customers with multiple locations, etc. So definitely for larger environments, definitely look at the database. You might want to think about SQL Express that's installed default. You might want to choose standard SQL in your environment. There's definitely limitations of the database, so keep that in mind. More than 2,500 nodes, you should then consider, standalone, multiple consoles, and definitely SQL database. Keep in mind that not only do these resources require memory to run, but to run the backups. So as you add more protection, you might want to look at the resources you have, make sure you size that correctly for future growth. So keep other things and factors like memory usage, network resources, bottlenecks. These can occur in these resources. Make sure you utilize your maintenance tools on a regular basis to make sure they're optimized. So be careful of single points of failures. Like I mentioned, RAID and other use of mechanism for fault tolerance should be thought of. Definitely, if it comes down to your RPO, that's definitely where you would need to look at the performance. Of course, the less RTO, you may have to add more resources to that to maintain that strict um, um, resource and compliancy. So definitely think that in mind. When you use standalone, definitely consider that's a single point of failure. When we talk about setting this resource up, if you're going to have a single standalone solution, ensure you have a copy recovery point or a replication. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you segment your data accordingly within the product, especially when doing backups. Make sure you utilize the local resource, local RPS to where the backup is. Make sure you organize your backups according to size or location or RPO. You don't want a less important server running at the same time as a more important server, similar as a 10 terabyte backup running with the 1 terabyte. Make sure you segment accordingly and make sure you have the adequate resources to define your RPO strategy. Ensure that the RPS, the recovery point service size as well. You may need multiple RPS to act as a data mover to handle, again, that inline global source ID dupe. Again, I cannot say enough. Try and avoid as many single point of failures as possible. So finally, in a nutshell, we define our RPSs as a device for backups and also replication. So keep that in mind. So if it's going to not only provide backup, but target for someone else's backup, that's more resources to consider. But as I mentioned, small, medium, large reference here. Here's a good sizing you could consider approach when deploying Arcserve UDP. So small, uh, let's consider a 10 terabyte. You can see 16, which is standard out of the box, so no big deal for that. 4 cores, also standard in a normal deployment. Typically, this is good for usable data of 4 terabytes. So you get again Lots of great savings without deduplication. The SSD drive at 120 gigs definitely accounts for that low resource utilization above. We talked about earlier how we should talk about RAID fault tolerance, making sure that our data that we invest in is protected. So you can see how all of our data stored across the board here are all protected in different types of RAID 5, RAID 6. It gets even better as we get in larger environments, which makes sense. And also the SSD gets bigger and better as well. So this is a good chart to again eye on examples on when configuring Arcserve unifying data protection. Medium, you can see how we have 50 terabytes, excuse me, and large is a good account for a 100 terabyte environment. Much more resources, of course, is going to be in demand. So you can see how everything is situated as needed. So hopefully, this section on sizing, best practicing, and how we give these examples on how we deploy the RPS and different strategies, and how you need to think about the resources that need to be provided for this resource, because it does a lot. Hopefully, this all information makes sense to you. Again, my name is Gary Sussman. Arcserve, Unified Data Protection, Sizing, Best Practice, and Scaling episode. Have a good day, everyone.